My baby dolls. It's been 9 months since the heavy hitter closed down his network. And now, Ralph Tycho, the Zigzag Man, has picked me up on the Comfortable Radio Network. And I'm joined here by the pinch hitter himself, Marc Weiss. And today, we're going to be talking about Yankee-Red Sox rivalry because I'm from New York City. And as most of you know, I moved to Massachusetts. And Marc is still living down in New York City in Staten Island. Welcome to the show, Marc.
Thank you. Good morning, I guess we can say, or whatever time it is, whoever's listening, wherever they are.
Yeah, it's 11:45. Well, let me ask you this, Marc. How long have you been living in New York City? And you follow the Yankees or Mets or both?
Follow both. Been living born and raised in Brooklyn, spent the first 32 years of my life there, and spent the last 19 years over here on Staten Island. So do the math, comes up to 51. That's how many years I've been in New York City and rooting for and following New York City sports.
And let me ask you this. I see that you went to Brooklyn College like I did. I graduated in 92. You must have graduated, 86, 87?
87. That is correct.
Yeah, you're about 4 years older than I am. So, we spoke the other day regarding the Yankees having a Staten Island team and, and all the stuff that goes on in Staten Island. In recent years, at least up here in Massachusetts, there's been talk of the Yankees-Red Sox rivalry dissipating. Do you agree with that?
I do, and it's only because of the fact that the Yankees have kind of taken a step back and they're in this semi-contend but rebuild process right now. And the Red Sox took a step back a few years before that. Let's face it, rivalries are great when both teams are hot and they're contending for a championship and vying for first place in the division. If one team's a little bit lesser than the other one, the rivalry's lesser. It only becomes the other guys playing a spoiler role. But there's still those roots, obviously. It's the two cities.
Well, the cities have always, in fact, there was a book written a few years ago on the rivalry to build the first subway between New York City and Boston. Boston ended up winning that as the Green Line up here is the oldest subway system. But the Yankees-Red Sox rivalry goes back even before the curse of the Bambino, because the Red Sox before they were winning world champions, and the Yankees were the Baltimore Orioles, and they moved to the Highlanders, where they played up in Washington Heights, and eventually became the New York Yankees, and then they traded Babe Ruth, and the curse ensued. Now, in my opinion, did the curse exist? I don't know. Up here in New England, for 86 years, they thought it was a curse. They went to 5 World Series during that span since they traded Babe Ruth, and they all lost in the 7th game of the World Series. So up here, it was a curse. Now, in New York, because I moved out in 93, before the 2004 season, did New York see Boston as an extreme rivalry?
Yeah, they did, and I think it's because Boston was always nipping at their heels, so they looked at it that way. And there was definitely, I think that rivalry really came back in the 70s, especially because the Yankees had a very combative veteran team, and I think that's what brought the rivalry back. But then again, neither team was really, a big time contender in the late 80s. I mean, Boston had good teams, but they weren't going to, win World Series with those teams. I mean, they had the Clemens teams, the Boggs teams, but I think it's just that the two towns, the rivalry between them, it's always there. Even when they're not contending, there's still some sort of rivalry. Is it the biggest in sports? I think it's close to the biggest in sports. A lot of people say Giants-Dodgers is bigger in baseball. People who root college football will say that Michigan and Ohio State is the rivalry. I think it's all your perspective and where you come from, to be quite honest.
And let me ask you this now. You and I are post Dodgers and Giants moving out of New York because they both moved out after the 57 season. But I can recall, and I don't know if you have recalled, my uncles and my father saying there used to be like street fights. Who was better, Willie Mays, Mickey Mantle, or Duke Snider in the outfield?
Yeah, I mean that story never gets old. I mean, I've heard about that, and people would get really passionate about their teams. My father-in-law always tells me that it wasn't easy growing up in Brooklyn being a Yankee fan. I have friends whose dads were Giants fans and they grew up in Brooklyn. I think the Brooklyn fan was probably the most passionate about their team. The joke that I always heard was, Yankee fans are kind of like rooting for U.S. Steel. They were very, used to winning, and it became that it wasn't a big deal for them. Giants fans were kind of corporate and stuff like that, and the team didn't really play to the local fare. It was like more like they wanted to be the New York State team and not the local team. But Brooklyn was about a borough.
Brooklyn was the borough, and what's amazing about it is that that you can be black, you can be Indian, you can be Chinese, you could be segregated in every neighborhood in Brooklyn. But when the Dodgers played at Abbott, they all sat next to one another in the crowd.
That's absolutely true. And then as far as like the other teams, that really wasn't the case. Like you look at some of those old films and you'll see that not that they had segregated sections, but you'd see like a certain area within the stands, you'd see mostly black folks sitting there. And different ethnic groups would segregate themselves accordingly. But you're right. In Brooklyn, especially since it was the smaller of the three places, it only sat 35,000. People sat together, and they left their differences at the gate. And when they walked into the ballpark, they were Dodger fans, and they were probably the most rabid fans in baseball. I mean, the only thing close to Ebbets Field today would be the experience of going to Wrigley Field in Chicago. Same type of experience, 35,000 seats. It's a neighborhood ballpark, and even when the Cubs weren't winning, they still sold that place. It'd be easier to get a White Sox ticket when they were in first place than get a Cubs ticket when they were in last place.
It was that rabid, and a lot of people don't know that there were three baseball teams in Brooklyn in the late 1890s from different leagues. But for Brooklyn, when the Dodgers moved out, it like ripped the heart out of Brooklyn. I got that perception growing up in the 70s and 80s. How was your perception of that at the same time period?
I got the same exact perception. It really was a borough that was searching for its identity, because by the time we came around, the change in composition of the borough was just really completely changing at that point. And I think the Dodgers were part of the downfall. They weren't the one reason for it, but they were the thing that kind of united people in the borough as it was changing, and it constantly changes. I mean, Brooklyn is just what it is. It's always changing. It's never going to stay static. It's not that type of place, but people did really love that team, and it lost its identity. And by the 70s, I mean, the city felt second rate anyway. I mean, with budget crunches, crime, neighborhoods that just weren't safe. It wasn't the same place that people were looking at nostalgically from back in like the 40s and 50s. And I think that had a lot to do with it. I think the fact that when the Dodgers left, they were still a huge contender, and they had so many named players on that team that it hurt when they left. When the Giants left, the team was in decline. Their stadium was in decline. The neighborhood was in decline. You don't hear too many people waxing poetic like, oh, those days when the Giants were here. I know Ralph will, because he's a Giants fan. But most of the time when you hear about the teams leaving, it's people thinking about the Dodgers leaving because they were so ingrained in the neighborhood. They lived in the neighborhood. One guy actually stayed.
Yeah, that's right. Gil Hodges.
Gil Hodges guy, he stayed.
Gil Hodges, he grew up. In fact, I'm friends with his daughter on on Facebook, and she's always commenting on my posts. And they stayed right there on Bedford Avenue.
Absolutely. His wife was a Brooklyn girl. She wasn't going to leave. They stayed in Brooklyn. And if you get me off on a tangent, I'm going to start ranting and raving on how that man is not in the Hall of Fame and how it's incomplete without him being enshrined there. But I guess we could probably do 10 shows on that.
We could, and if you read, what's his name, the last book on Gil Hodges, written by Matt Zucker, I think is Matt Zactor, Morty Zactor was his name. He grew up in the Midwest, and he made his home in Brooklyn. I mean, these guys used to just go down to a candy store, get cigarettes, which ended up killing Hodges in 72. But, it's funny because, again, he was a Dodger, and what did he become? He became a Met. He became a Met manager. And I think the thing is, you and I weren't around between 58 and 62 when the golden mecca of baseball went from 3 teams to 1 team. And what I've heard was people didn't follow baseball who were Dodgers and Giants fans until the Mets came into existence in 62. They had Dodger blue, and they had the NY emblem in orange for the Giants.
That's the gospel. It's absolutely true because my grandparents and my mom were diehard Dodger fans. My mother would always take the IRT from East New York where she grew up and take it over to down on Eastern Parkway and walk down the 3 avenues to go to the games in Ebbets Field. And when the Dodgers left, she had no interest in baseball whatsoever. And I could tell you, growing up, like my mom and my grandfather were the 2 biggest influences on me when it came to like sports and baseball. And they became rabid Met fans when the Mets came into existence. But for those like 4 years, they didn't care. And I used to say, like, did you guys ever like get in a car and drive down to like Philly to see the Dodgers when they came in those 10 times to play the Phillies in Connie Mack Stadium? And they were like, no, they left. Who cared? They just didn't care. Did you ever think of rooting for the Yankees? The Yankees? Are you kidding me? So what'd you do? Just didn't care. I mean, it's like, and I think that's like going cold turkey from an addiction. When you go from being a rabid Dodger fan to just not caring about anything, not even watching the game or listening to it. And that's what they did. And then when the Mets came, it didn't matter if they stunk for like the first 6 or 7 years. It didn't mean anything to them. They were just so glad to have a baseball team after having nothing for 4 years.
And that's because, number one, they hated the Yankees. Again, you mentioned it's like despised them. And you had an extra bonus.
Hate is not strong enough word.
No, they despised him. But this is where I'm getting at. They even had Casey Stengel as their first manager, who won 12 pennants and 7 World Series. Well, was it? 10 pennants, 7 World Series in a 12-year span.
Yep.
And this is where I'm going with the Boston rivalry.
And then they got George Weiss too, who was their GM.
Yeah, he was cheap, man. People don't know about George Weiss that he used to nickel and dime the players. Like Yogi Berra didn't win the MVP one year. He got like a $5,000 cut. But what people didn't know about Weiss is that he would get the leftover money he saved from nickel and diming these players for years due to the reserve clause.
Well, let's face it. They'd send out a contract every year to a guy, and if he didn't sign it, well, he wasn't going to play unless you had the leverage of like DiMaggio, who would always hold out because he knew that he had some sort of leverage. But the average guy had no leverage. There were no guaranteed contracts, and the reserve clause didn't allow you to go anyplace. And so you could do stuff like that. And some GMs were worse than others. Now, the synergy here is that Boston was different. The Yawkey family, especially Mr. Yawkey, were very generous to their ball players. Whereas like the Yankees were winning all these championships and getting nickel and dimed, and Boston, who had some great contending teams in the late 40s and early 50s, they were paying those guys as if they were winning strings of championships. And I think Ted Williams used to say that the Yankees were much hungrier than we were because they needed their World Series money to make it, and we were getting paid well.
That's absolutely true. Mr. Yorkie was good to his players up here when he took the team over in the 1930s and 40s and lasted well into the 70s. But they did pay Boston players. It's different because here it's like it's a little community. Have you ever been to Fenway Park?
I've been to Fenway at least 5 or 6 times. Last time I went was about 2 years ago.
And how do you feel about Fenway Park versus? We'll get into the New York, the brand new City Field and the brand new Yankee Stadium. What do you think's the difference between those 3 stadiums?
Well, Fenway Park is a cathedral at this point. It's what, the second oldest ballpark. I think Wrigley's older than Fenway by a few days or hours or something like that. It's a great place. It's got so many stories that go along with it. I mean, obviously it's the hottest ticket to purchase. Every time I've gone up there, I've paid $60 to sit in a bleacher seat. And I go to Yankee Stadium, I'll spend $11 to sit in a bleacher seat. So put that in perspective. I mean, Fenway has less seats. Its location is obviously, it's a great location. I mean, I've loved that place. I'd love to go there. And Yankee Stadium, the new one, I mean, what's the best way to describe it? I've heard someone call it a shopping mall with the baseball diamond in it.
How about corporate?
Yankees have always been corporate. I mean, so I don't think that that's anything that's new. I think the Yankees have always been corporate. I mean, they wear pinstripe suits just like people who work for corporations. So I don't think that's a change. I just think that it's bigger. Whereas like with Citi Field, the Mets went smaller from Shea Stadium. They went more to the roots of the franchise, to kind of like the Ebbets Field kind of look and feel and the closeness, and made it that way. Whereas the Yankees went bigger, badder, grander, and stuff like that. That's the Yankee world. At that point when they built it, I mean, they could sell 4 million tickets. And so they wanted big. They wanted bad. They put in a Hard Rock Cafe. They have a steakhouse. They have a Mohegan Sun lounge. I mean, they went crazy with it. But then there's some things they didn't do that were great. Like Monument Park, which I don't know if you remember, but I remember it from going to the old Yankee Stadium. Originally, the monuments were on the field. They had the 3 big monuments on the field with the flagpole in center field. I remember Bobby Mercer chasing fly balls that bounced through over his head, that bounced through the monuments and picked them up through there. When they first refurbished Yankee Stadium and opened it up in '76, that's when they made Monument Park, and it got bigger. But it was really nice, and it was in a great area. You could see it on TV. Now it's hidden. You really can't see it on TV, and the overhang from the Mohegan Sun Lounge covers it up too, so you don't get a good view of it. It's nice when you go into it, but they sunk it, and the view of it from TV isn't the same.
That's right. I remember posting pictures. I remember Mercer going around the monuments just to get the fly ball, and that would just let the runner continue to run because of the place of it. Now, let me ask you about this again with the Yankee. This is where I'm headed. Again, do you think, living in New York City all your life, because again, I'm a transplant. I've lived 23 years in New York. Came up here, as my listeners know, to law school. Decided to stay. My kids are Red Sox fans. My wife's a Red Sox fan. I'm a Yankees fan. I live 10 minutes away from Gillette Stadium.
So basically, you have a mixed marriage.
Yeah, I do have a mixed marriage. I do. Well, when you play around in Massachusetts and you find a wife, chances are she's from here. But do you see the rivalry between what was the Yankees, Giants, and Dodgers, and then it was Yankees and Mets, and that kind of hatred? Do you see it more against Boston? Do you think it's less against Boston the way that these teams' history goes?
I think it's just the nature of the two towns too. I think that while Boston, I think for years kind of had like, there was like, the tough South Boston blue collar kind of thing. But I think that that's changed in recent years. I think because Boston is you went up there for school, and I think Boston is first and foremost a college town. I mean, there's so many great schools up there. And I think people do what you did. They go up there for education, they like the environment, and they stay. So it's become more of an academic kind of thing, whereas I think like the New York fan is more of a blue collar fan. So I think that that's added to the rivalry. Kind of the blue collar versus the white collar academic kind of thing. So I think that's what's changed. I think that's what's changed in the nature of the rivalry. But the two cities definitely, it's against each other, and when the two teams contend, it really, I mean, those tickets are hard to come by. Those tickets are, you want to be there, you want to see those games. And when somebody, I mean, I've seen people go to a Yankee game wearing Boston stuff, and especially when I saw it like in the 70s, like during that heated part of the rivalry, like 77, 78, it got really it got really heated. People would throw things at them. I'm not a big advocate of that, by the way. I think if somebody goes to a game and they're wearing the opponent's garb, it's one thing to tease them and have some friendly banter, but fisticuffs and throwing things at people, I mean, I had that happen to me when I went to a Giants-Eagles game in Philadelphia. I can tell you there's just no place for it. That's going over the line. So if you're listening, kids, don't do it.
I have to give you some instances because you brought up an interesting topic. I wanted to start something, another thing, but I'm going to go into this violence thing. In May 2008, a Yankees fan in Nashua, New Hampshire, which is probably about an hour from me, right up, was arrested and charged with reckless second-degree murder for killing two people outside a bar, which resulted from an argument over the rivalry. Also in 2008, a man driving a car with New York license plates in Mass was pulled from his car and savagely beaten because locals suspected the man of being a Yankee fan. And during the final series of the 2010 season, Boston police arrested a Yankees fan for stabbing a Red Sox fan over an argument about the rivalry.
Now, the question I have to ask you about that is, would alcohol have been involved in every or any of those instances?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the bar killing, definitely. The bar thing up in New Hampshire, definitely. But even with the bar, I'm going to tell you, I live up here. I've been living here now 24 years. It's going to go on more than half of my life. I can tell you, my kids are in Little League up here, and they have almost every team in Little League they can have, except a Yankee team. They have an Oakland A's team. They have a New York Mets team. They have any team you could think of with the uniforms, but they refuse to have the Yankees team because no one would want to play for the Yankees because it's so ingrained within the culture of New England what the Yankees were, the curse. It's such a hatred, only through misfortune throughout the years, whereas the Yankees are the most celebrated and championship worthy of 27 World Series, through the years. The Red Sox only won 3 in the last, 100 years.
Yeah, but those 3 have been in the last 15, so.
Well, but it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The Yankees are in a rebuilding stage. All the veterans who were part of the 2009 championship World Series, team, are creaking. Look at CC Sabathia, Teixeira retired, Jeter.
But the Yankees have no one to blame but themselves. When CC opted out, they didn't have to go furnish him with that huge contract and that huge extension. They chose to do that. Same thing with A-Rod. They could have turned around and said to those guys, you know what? We won a championship with you. We got what we needed. We'd love you to stay, but go on the open market. And I can guarantee you that when they gave A-Rod that money, there was nobody on the open market who was going to give him anything near that. They bid against themselves. It was actually stupid, but I think the greatest advantage the Yankees have, which other teams don't, like, to be honest, the Yankees, when they built their dynasty in the mid-'90s that ran all the way until, let's say, about 2011, 2012. The reason they were able to do that is because they grew talent. They had homegrown talent, which they kept because Steinbrenner was suspended and he couldn't trade it. That's another story for another time, I guess. But they did that, and they also had the wherewithal and the finances to be able to keep those guys and not let them go to other teams. Like the Mets have this great young pitching staff. They're not going to keep them all because the Mets ownership is never going to pay all of them to stay, whereas the Yankees could do that. And that was the greatest advantage the Yankees had, was not the free agents they could bring in, but their young core that they could keep and let age and stay and get older and stick with the team. That was also their curse too, because they let those guys get old and stay together for so long, and there were no heir apparents. So I think they paid for it in the end, but the reality of it is they had a great 15-year run, which nobody other than really Atlanta had.
Right. Atlanta won 14 championships from 91 through about 2006, 5 or 6.
Yep.
But let me ask you this question, which I wanted to ask you before. There was talk between the Yankees and Red Sox in 1947 when all the players came back from the war to trade Ted Williams for Joe DiMaggio and Yogi Berra. And the only reason why the trade didn't go through is because they had to include Berra. Now you know that DiMaggio played to 51.
Well, of course they had to include Berra, because think about it. Well, first of all, in 47, Berra was Larry Berra, and he was an unknown entity. So, right. And the Red Sox at least were smart enough to recognize that he had some talent. He also didn't fit the Yankee mold either. He didn't look like that tall, slender, corporate Yankee guy. He got the nickname because he said he's squat and he looked like a yogi. So I think that judging on that, plus the Yankees always had tons of people that they signed in the minors, so they probably didn't think much of him. Plus he didn't work with Bill Dickey yet to really refine his skills as a catcher. So I can understand that. But if you think about it, Williams was really in his prime in 47, and DiMaggio was really in his decline. He was starting to become injury prone. He was still a great player after World War II, but he wasn't that same prolific great DiMaggio that he was from 36 to 42. Those numbers that he put up from 36 to 42, if he never came back after World War II, I think he would have still been put in the Hall of Fame. Yeah, he was just that awesome. He was just that off the charts. No one played like him.
He would have. Now, do you think that the Yankees still would have been a better team with Williams, or do you think, because if Williams would have joined the team, a lot of people wouldn't be there. Mickey Mantle might not be there. Roger Maris might not be there.
You know what? What do they say in sports? Sometimes the best trades you make are the ones you don't. And in that case, I think the best trade was the one. It was better for both teams that they didn't make that trade, because what were they going to do? Bring in Joe and then move Dom to right field or left field, put the brothers together. I don't see how that trade helps and makes Boston better. And to be quite frank, the Yankees won 5 straight World Series from, 49 through 53.
9 to 53, yeah.
So did they need Ted Williams during that period of time? No, and they would have lost his services anyway, because he got drafted to go to Korea, unless Topping and Webb had that much power to keep him out of being brought back to the Marine Corps. Then I don't see how that would have helped, because they would have been 2+ years that he would have been out of service. Plus, I don't know that Ted plays a good enough left field to cover the ground in Yankee Stadium. When we look at the numbers and say, yeah, like imagine how many home runs he would have hit in Yankee Stadium, But then again, he wasn't a dead pull hitter down the line. He was a right center field gap home run hitter, and that wasn't exactly a chip shot in Yankee Stadium. It wasn't much bigger, if not bigger at all, than Fenway. So I don't know. I think in the Yankees case, it could only have hurt their history. I don't see how it makes them better considering their dominance. I mean, maybe it helps Boston a little bit getting that DiMaggio presence, but he faded real quick. So I think the best trade not made. I mean, maybe if that trade was offered up, like let's say in 1941, well, yeah, I mean, maybe that's a prolific trade for both teams.
You mentioned 41, and that's part of the rivalry because, again, That was the last year that anyone hit 400. Williams hit 406, but he lost the MVP candidate to Joe DiMaggio because he had a 56-game winning streak.
Yep, the 56-game. Well, a lot of people forget that the 56-game hitting streak could have easily been a 72-game hitting streak because he started up another one right after that.
Yeah,
but, and he was really, really hot. But I think one of the real reasons why DiMaggio won the MVP was because of the dominance that he had in the field, because he was a complete ball player. I mean, this guy was a prolific outfielder and made it look easy. Ted Williams was a prolific hitter, but he wasn't necessarily the greatest glove man. I mean, you hear people in Boston. I mean, you're up there, so you know people will talk about how great Yaz was playing the wall at Fenway. You don't hear people ever talk about Ted doing that. That wasn't his thing. His thing wasn't fielding. And so I think that, you know, in DiMaggio's case, he won the MVP with his glove, with his bat, and the fact that his team won the World Series.
That's
and
right.
Ted's team didn't.
Well, you know, and Ted Williams, and to put a final lock on this, Ted Williams did say, Ted Williams always proclaimed himself to be the greatest hitter in baseball. But he would always say the greatest all-around player he ever saw was Joe DiMaggio. And Williams wrote a book on, before he became the manager of the Washington Senators and then Texas Rangers, The Science of Hitting. Because
I've read it.
And that's what he was, Ted Williams. He was if he didn't lose 7 years due to World War II and Korea being a Marine air pilot, God knows what his numbers would have been.
Well, you know what? I'll take a step back on that one too, and I think I will never take anything away from the hitting prowess of Ted Williams, nor would I ever take anything away from the great service he gave to our country. Like, I mean, they always said to Ted, if they made a movie about your life, who would play you, John Wayne? He goes, no, I am the real John Wayne. So with all that said, he still wasn't the greatest hitter of all time. That Ruth guy was.
No, and you know, Ruth isn't a special category by himself.
That's it. But that's the point. Ruth is in such a special category that when we say the greatest hitter of all time, it's basically comparing everyone but Ruth.
Right. And, you know,
he doesn't come into the mix because he's in a world all to himself.
Well, you know, I think Ty Cobb is in that world, but I think that's for another time. I did it on Ralph's show. You can always listen to me being interviewed by Ralph. But here's something that sparked the rivalry even more. In 1948, there was a 3-dog race for the American League pennant. Cleveland, the Red Sox, and the Yankees. But Joe McCarthy, longtime manager of the Yankees, came out of retirement because of an argument with the Yankees establishment and despited him by being the manager of the Red Sox. How do you think fueled that rivalry? Because it set it up for the great summer of '49.
Well, I think it definitely fueled that rivalry because anytime anyone has ever gone from one team to the other, that's been obviously Ruth was the first. I mean, Ruth was a megastar when he came to the Yankees. Obviously, his prowess was in pitching at that point. He probably would have been in the Hall of Fame as a pitcher, but long before everyone could realize that he could swing a 52-ounce bat. But that started it all, and certainly McCarthy going over to Boston was huge. That was a great 3-horse race, and the funny thing about it is nobody else was even in the picture besides those 3 horses. And it came down to the playoff, the 1-game playoff between Cleveland and Boston that year too. And yeah, I mean then 49. Obviously, if anyone's read the great Halverson book about that season,
summer of '49.
That's a great read. I loved reading that book because you look at it and it comes down to that. It comes all down to that one weekend. Yankees win 2 games, or they're done. Boston wins 1 game, and they win it. And it's also I think really like Joe DiMaggio's like really his last real shining star moment because he was out until June. that season.
He was
He
out
had heel
most of
spurs.
foot injury.
He had heel spurs, and they didn't know how to treat it. He wasn't healing right, and the Yankees were pretty much languishing. And then all of a sudden, he comes back into the mix. They still win 94 games, but I mean, in 48, but in 49, he comes back and they win the whole thing with him. But he has an incredible stretch, and I think that's like his last moment as a super mega star. But the McCarthy rub is definitely a big piece to it, no question about it. I mean, anytime Boston or New York can take one of their guys and needle him back, I'm sure nobody in Boston was thrilled when Wade Boggs and Roger Clemens came to New York to win their championships.
Oh, they were cursing up a storm up here when that happened. But even before those guys, God.
But you know that it wasn't because they were jealous or annoyed that they won championships somewhere else. Because I remember when Ray Bork won the Stanley Cup with Colorado, and people in Boston wanted to give him a parade because they were so glad that he actually won a Stanley Cup. So people in Boston aren't jealous that the guy went somewhere else to win. They just didn't want those two guys going to New York and winning.
Right, but when Bork brought the cup back to
right.
I went to go see him because I followed Bork's career all my life, and when I moved to
Boston, if he won the cup with the Rangers, they would not have been happy about that.
No, or the Islanders, no.
Exactly.
A lot of people had resentment that Bork left, Boston to go get a cup because Boston had a pretty good team in those years. Cam Neely. They were in the '87 Cup against the mighty Edmonton Oilers. Boston's a very proud city. I think what you mentioned before, again, blue collar versus academia. The Red Sox fans up here are the most knowledgeable fans in all of baseball. I give them that because they are well versed, well read, and there's tons of books on New England baseball. It all stems from the communities in every small town. I live in a town that's 28,000 people, 25,000 people. Back in Brooklyn, I had 28,000 people on my block.
That's true.
I live in the middle of nowhere. I own part of the lake, and I own the river that runs past my house, and I'm far away from, any kind of, I don't know, mankind or whatever you want. I mean, I'm going from an apartment building with 1,200 people and, doing this. But Ellie Howard, I speak to Fritz Peterson by phone, and he was on my show last year, and he'll be back on the show this year. But he told me when they traded Ellie Howard to the Red Sox in '67, his heart sank because, again, Ellie was the first African-American player to New York Yankees. But not only that, in '67, the Red Sox, the impossible dream, won the pennant. And Fritz was jealous.
He could be.
He was instrumental. They just lost the Cardinals again in '7 in the World Series. Now, in the 1970s, we have two fights between Carlton Fisk and Thurman Munson. The latter being Nettles punching Lee right in the face, and him falling on his arm, which he was never
sucker punch.
He did. Let's go into that.
Well, I think Greg Nettles was looked at as the toughest guy on those tough Yankee teams. And if you've ever read the Golenbach book, The Bronx Zoo, you get a real good picture of what was going on there. Those guys didn't exactly get along with each other, but they were winners. And I think that the Red Sox, if you go back in the lineage of the Red Sox, Fenway Park was a ghost town until the incredible dream season of '67. From the mid-'50s until the mid-'60s, for well over a decade, the Red Sox were a non-entity, and people didn't go to the games. But then in that season, all of a sudden it came back, and then, to your point, Ellie Howard gets traded up there. Now, granted, he didn't exactly knock the cover off the ball, but his steady leadership and being a great catch-and-throw catcher at that point in his career really helped the team, get over the top and win the pennant. But at that point, from '67 on, the Red Sox are now back to being, in the pantheon of baseball. And the Yankees were in their full-blown declinesty at that point. I mean, they were just, as Fritz would call it, the Horace Clarke years. I've read Fritz's book. I've actually talked to Fritz. Well, not personally, but on Facebook messaging and chatting back and forth. And during that period of time, you're right. The Yankees were the poor sisters to the Red Sox. And the Red Sox always had a good team, but just not good enough. I think it was like, what was it, 72? Was that like mini strike season? The Red Sox lost out by a half game or something to Detroit.
Right.
You know,
yep.
So I mean, they were always there and contending. And let's face it, fans were always wanted to get that ring for Yaz. You know, he was the guy. And then come 75, they have those two awesome rookies. You got Jim Rice, and then you have Freddie Lynn. And so, and Boston wins the pennant, and again, like you said, loses in Game 7. Then this time they lose to the Cincinnati Reds, the Big Red Machine. Although they weren't the Big Red Machine at that point, because they were the big choking machine, because they had found a way to lose all the big games at that point, and they finally got over the top when they beat Boston. They were actually down in Game 7, and I think it was Joe Morgan hit a big home run, and that put them over the top. But from 75 on, the Red Sox had these two young guys, a lot of great players. Yaz, you know, he had this extended, you know, period of time where his prime lasted a long period of time. He played an awful long time. So they thought they were going to win. And all of a sudden, Moneybags, George Steinbrenner comes into the mix. And next thing you know, the Yankees are becoming contenders, and they usurp the Red Sox once again. It was supposed to be Boston's time, and now it's back to the Yankees again. It's like, I think that really stoked the rivalry, and I think the players hated each other. I think Fisk and Munson hated each other. I think, and that might be too weak of a word to describe it. And I think every time those teams got on the field, it was definitely a fight waiting to happen, because the Red Sox thought it was their time. And the Yankees were a lot of veteran, chippy players. I mean, Steinbrenner was smart enough to bring in a lot of guys who came from the Oakland A's, you know, dynasty team, because Charlie Finley was basically having a fire sale, and the Yankees were bringing people on board, and those guys were chippy players too. I mean, they didn't get along with each other in the Oakland locker room, and so the only thing that the Yankees would fight more than themselves were the Red Sox.
And you know, it all came to a head on October 2nd, 1978. And
Bucky effing
yeah, and but he didn't win it for them when you think about it. He didn't. I mean, Torres gave up a 3-run homer, but Boston came back, I think, within a run or so. Anyway, I think it was Reggie Jackson who put it away. But when I came,
it was really Goose Gossage who won it for him, because he came in there, and when he came in there throwing what he was throwing, the Red Sox bats, I mean, what was it? Yaz popped out to Nettles to end the game. He just couldn't get around on that thing. I mean, Yaz hit a home run earlier.
You know, and the Yankees were still going through a turbulent time. They had won 2 pennants in a row, 1 World Series in '77, and Sparky Lyle, who was the Cy Young Award winner,
I remember that.
And they're bringing Goose Gossage, and Nettles is like, you're going to go from Cy Young to
Sayonara.
Yeah, and he was right. He was right. I mean, Nettles told Fritz, he's like, Nettles always had it. They called him Puff because he would say something just like you said and didn't just leave. He said Fritz was like, I spoke to Gabe Paul, and he says I can trade me to Cleveland or Philly. I think he said, you better start packing your bags to Cleveland soon.
Yep.
So, and he was on the plane to Cleveland. But when I came up here in '93, and I questioned a couple of the patrons in the bar down, but they looked like they wanted to kill me. I mean, I'm a Yankees fan. I got comfortable up here, and when I wear my Yankee gear in town, a lot of people know me, so they know I'm from New York. And they say, okay, well, that's fine. You get a couple of people who say you haven't converted. I'm like, I'll never convert. But you get most of the people saying, well, it's an excuse. You came from New York. I don't understand anyone. And there's a few of us up here who like the Yankees, who were born in New England, because it's just so ingrained in the rivalry in New England. The Yankees are hated. It's like U.S. Steel. You just want to see them lose. I think you could see it when the Patriots won when they won the Super Bowl. They yelled "Yankees suck" at the parade in 2002 during the parade in Boston, and I was surprised with that because 9/11 had just happened. But that's how ingrained it is, in Boston. Now, let me ask you this, and we'll end the show on this note. What do you think about the rebuilding of the Yankees, and what do you think about the Red Sox getting Sally and a couple of other players in the offseason? And how do you think these two teams are going to stack up for the 2017 season?
Well, let's just do a preview of that because I think that probably is our next show, is just do a preview of that incomplete. But I'll talk about the rebuilding. I think that the Yankees realize they have to do it the right way. I think they tried to do it the right way a few years back. Remember when they had those three young pitchers, Jabba, Ian Kennedy, and Phil Hughes, and they thought that was going to be their next generation. They had learned that from the Red Sox. Because if you remember, Theo went with all those young pitchers. Was it like Buchholz and Lester and all of those guys? Because I think everyone starts to realize that free agent pitchers are like the white whale. You just don't get anything. It now doesn't exist because by the time you get them at 32 years of age, their arms are all beat up and there's not a lot left in the tank, so to speak. And quite honestly, they cost a fortune. I mean, look what the Yankees have to pay CC Sabathia. So the Yankees went to rebuild, well, semi-build then, by they were going for young pitching, but those guys either didn't pan out or they didn't handle them the right way. And that could have really blown everything up, and the Yankees could have gone back into, like, remember the mid to late 80s Yankees where they would constantly have great free agent hitters and score 5 runs a game but give up 7 because they had no pitching. But thankfully, Cash was really smart and decided that they're going to rebuild. And I think to the point right now where I think Baseball America has the Yankees rated as having the best farm system in baseball.
They do.
They've done the right thing. The chips are there, but as we all know, there's that fine line for when prospects turn into either real players or suspects. And that's what we'll start to see. I mean, that young catcher, I went to the Dodger-Yankees game in September. I never thought I'd say I went to a Dodger-Yankees game and it wasn't a World Series game. But I went to the Dodger-Yankee game in September and I saw the ball fly off that guy's bat. I mean, there's a special sound that comes off of his bat. His major league numbers, by the way, were better than his minor league numbers. So I think he's a blue chip player. I hope they don't fall into the trap of what everyone always does when they find a guy who can hit and catch, is try to make him a first baseman or a third baseman. But we'll see how that plays itself out. Judge is a big guy, but he's got a lot of holes in his swing. So I think that's got to get fixed. But the Yankees have the minor league system. It's just a question of executing, whether it's bringing these guys up and having them take their spot and then getting some key veterans in to shepherd them to the next level. If they can do that, if this group pans out like the core four did, 20 years ago, the Yankees could go on another 15-year run. And that would be awesome. There's no question about it. But that remains to be seen. And I guess we can talk about that now in Boston's case. I think that bringing in that lefty is a good move. I mean, obviously Chicago is in fire sale mode, so they were getting rid of him. I mean, he's got great numbers. He's got great stuff. And maybe they're not sold on what Price did last year. I mean, wasn't Price's ERA right around 4?
It was, but again, Price is one of those pitches where I think he'll rebound because he is one of the marquee pitches.
He is a marquee pitcher, no question.
And they got great hitting, even with Poppy retiring.
Well, that's the thing I wanted to ask you about, because Poppy's been tweeting lately a whole load of very ambiguous stuff. Like he put a tweet out there that said Boston Globe with a question mark. It's like is Poppy starting to look back and say, hey, wait a second. I did want to quit, but how many guys walk away from the game, putting up a 315 season with 38 homers and leading the league with 127 ribbies.
And that's the thing.
I mean,
That's the
I
thing.
can only think of a handful of people in any sport who've walked away on top, two being Jim Brown and Koufax.
Well,
You don't see
Ted Williams.
people do this.
Ted Williams
I mean,
walked away.
he had good numbers, but they weren't the Ted Williams numbers of in his prime. I mean, Poppy's numbers from last year look like the same numbers he put up when he was 30.
And again, those guys were in their 20s when they retired. Koufax, he's 40
Right.
years old and he's still hitting 315. I think he might be. I think he might be coming back.
I mean, it's one thing if he comes back. I think he's in a good spot to come back. It's like if Jeter decided to come back after he retired. Jeter was a Yankee icon who played his whole career there, like in the mode of Mantle. And if he came back after that victory tour, that farewell lap, I think that would have been an embarrassing thing. He couldn't do that even if he wanted to, and he didn't do it. But in Poppy's case, I think he's the kind of player that, with that great smile and people kind of love him, that I don't think anyone would begrudge a guy, who had a 1.021 OPS coming back. And especially, let's say this team has a window of 2 or 3 years where they can really do a lot of damage. As a DH, maybe he can get another 2 years.
And I'm thinking the same way. There's been rumors up here. People are very excited about it. But we're just going to have to see if he shows up to spring training.
Well, I say for our next show, we got to get somebody on who's like close to being in the know, and let's grill him.
That's true. Well, Mark, I hope you had fun today.
Let's get Dan Shaughnessy on. Let's grill him.
Yeah, you know what? Let's try to get Bill Lee on and Fritz, because they usually hang out together, and we'll do that. Fritz is usually on my show. But what's going to happen is how the show's going to go. I'm going to be calling up a lot of authors whose books I have. That's how my shows usually run. And we get to talk about a historical piece, and you'll be part of it. Like you said, you're a pinch hitter for the network. When you're here, that's good. I'm going to try to rearrange the shows to accommodate your schedule. And let's have some fun. How's that sound?
Sounds good. I definitely want to talk to Bill Lee, a guy who I've heard was the only person left of Bill Lee was Vladimir Lenin.
Yeah, I know. Hold the line. This is how I end the show. Folks, I had a great time talking with Mark and getting back to my Brooklyn days and comparing my time in New England. I'm just happy that Genesis is back on the air. And as always, I'm going to leave you in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow. Good night, folks, and good luck. Mark, hold the line. I'm going to be shutting down, and we'll see you next time.